Welcome to this video about the proposed best forced landing site or sites, depending on the situation. For my fellow air traffic controllers, for the record, I'm filming this on January 14th of 2021. This is really an extension of and a companion to a video that I filmed yesterday about the various risk factors that go into making potential forced landing sites better or worse than other potential forced landing sites. Typically for forced landings, we're normally thinking about single-engine GA airplanes with engine failures, although there can be other situations. I will focus again primarily in this video on single-engine airplanes with engine failures, although we will by extension be able to apply it to some other situations as well. All right, we got a lot to cover, so let's get started. So first of all, I want to just note that whether we like it or not, the situation is always more complicated than we would like. And so in terms of different kinds of situations, I do want controllers to be aware of the weather and time, because that makes a difference in some of these things. Whether it's day or night makes a big difference. Forced landings at night are rather unpleasant because you really can't see much in terms of where you're going in many cases. VMC or IMC makes a big difference. Again, it's a visibility sort of issue until you're down low, and then your choices are much more restricted in many cases. Surface winds make a big difference. I'm not going to talk about surface winds very much, but certainly once the wind gets up above 10 knots for most of these single-engine GA airplanes, all other factors being equal, it's much better to land into the wind, although it's not necessary, and sometimes local terrain will dictate where you're going. If you're over an urban area with just lousy possible spots, but you've got a decent spot, it happens to be downwind, and you're not going to get there with enough altitude to turn around and land back into the wind, it's quite plausible that a pilot will quite reasonably elect to land downwind at a decent site rather than turn around upwind into a poor site. The airplane type makes a big difference in terms of speed and wingspan. So again, typical GA airplanes, I'm going to loosely define as airplanes with a clean stall speed of roughly 70, maybe 80 knots or less, okay, and kind of a 40-ish foot wingspan. Once you get to faster, bigger airplanes, then some of these forced landing situations really begin to change. Okay. In terms of potential sites, I loosely break them up into various categories. So airports into paved and unpaved airports or runways. You can have airports with a mix of both, but as long as it has at least one paved runway, even if it has other grass runways and things, I consider it a paved airport. Roads, I break roads up into basically two categories. One is divided highways, where you have multiple lanes, where each set of lanes is going one direction, and then you have a different set of lanes with some kind of median going the other direction. Divided highways does not include more like your 4-lane roads where you got 2 lanes in each way. Whether or not it has a left turn lane kind of in the middle or something like that, they're not truly divided in many ways. So divided highways and then just basically any other road, I all sort of lump those together. What I loosely call farm fields here, things that are prepared, cleared fields for agricultural purposes. Open terrain is a little bit of a catch-all. That could be almost anything that's just unimproved by mankind, generally speaking. Not counting hiking trails and things like that, but unless it's either trees or water. Forests or trees I count separately, and then water I count separately. Water can be anything from open ocean down to rivers and retention ponds, things like that. And then partly for discussion, really for kind of urban type areas, I do have some specialized engineered areas in mind that might reasonably considered as at least potential forced landing sites, things like golf courses, sports field complexes, where they've got these places where you've got, 4 or 5 baseball diamonds and 9 soccer fields or something for the kids, whatever, or adults, and large parking lots at strip malls, shopping centers, the big box stores, things like that. Okay. So just by way of reminder, just the risk factors. These are the things that we're going to look at when we start to compare all of those different potential forced landing sites, keeping in mind we have different situations. It leads to a bewildering array of possibilities. So let me throw something up that's going to appear scary at first. I will work my way through it as quickly as possible. It will be far simpler than it seems to be at first glance, but you could imagine that we're going to put up a chart like this and sort of populate it, and then there's going to be a quiz later. and you have to get 70% score. Otherwise, you got to retake and rewatch this video, right? Okay, so here's my different kinds of potential sites over on the left. Here are the dozen or so risk factors up on top, and then we're going to kind of compare all these and figure out, maybe we're going to add these up and give them some kind of score or something. That is categorically not what we're going to do. We're going to work our way through this in a manner that should make sense to you so that you can kind of work your way through it and adapt it to individual situations as necessary. But then I will come to some firm conclusions, and by the end of this video, I will give you what is head and shoulders my best proposed off-airport landing site if somebody can't reach an airport. But we are going to start with airports. So here's how we're going to kind of build our way up to this chart. So the first two of what are going to be 3 steps really is, first of all, just understand the weather and time situation, also the basic aircraft situation. So I'm going to concentrate on day VMC situations for what I'm loosely calling normal single-engine aircraft. By normal, I'm talking wingspans really 40 feet-ish or less. By the time you get up to something like the Piper Malibu, Piper Matrix, Piper M350, that kind of airplane, you're looking at a slightly bigger wingspan, and we're starting to get up to kind of a tipping point on the touchdown speeds. Nothing against the Malibus, beautiful airplane and so on, but just that's about where the tipping point is. The things like the single-engine turboprops, so the TBMs, the Pilatus PC-12s, again, you're really starting to definitely get into the tipping point where you got bigger wingspans, higher speeds, and so on. Any twin-engine airplane, you're again looking at bigger wingspans, higher speeds, and so on. So I'm going to concentrate on these day VMC situations for these kind of normal single-engine aircraft. But the nice thing is this is the vast majority of the engine failure situations that we as controllers will have to deal with. There are going to be occasions where we're talking to a twin who has dual engine failure. That's just going to suck and we're going to have to deal with it. But if you can kind of get your head around day VMC for normal single-engine aircraft, you can adapt for these more unique and rare situations. Now, step 2, as we first go through the chart, I'm going to break it down into basically 4 sections, so that what we're doing is to a large extent trying to compare apples to apples at any given point. So let's get started. So the first category we're going to look at is airports. We're going to kind of consider paved runways to grass and dirt runway only airports. Roads, we're going to compare divided highways with the two-way, two-lane roads, and by extension other kind of two-way roads, even if they're a bit wider. I've got really 5 kind of potential landing sites that I'm loosely categorizing as terrain. These are more or less unimproved by human hand, although farm fields have certainly been touched and so on. Okay, and then the last 3 are kind of those, what I'm loosely considering urban development type things. Again, the urban areas are just going to have really poor choices, and these 3 may or may not be better than a lot of the other really bad places you might consider going to if we're ever unfortunate enough to talk to somebody who's kind of over an urban area with these situations. So, all right, let's get started. To do that, let me just highlight upper left before we kind of get into this that, again, I'm focusing on day VMC in what I'm calling normal single-engine aircraft, and that means that the clean stall, that is with the flaps up, is typically less than about 70 knots. Maybe just tick over that a little bit, and again, wingspans less than 40 feet. All right, so let's start with just these situations for airports. And what I'm going to do here as we kind of skim our way through this is I'm going to grab the highlighter, and occasionally I will highlight ones that are particularly relevant. So paved runways. Okay, so first of all, paved runways, are they visible to witnesses? Maybe. I mean, uncontrolled airports, there's no guarantee that somebody's going to watch you land and so on. Grass or dirt runways, there's a slightly smaller chance that somebody will watch, but this isn't that big a deal. Slight tipping advantage to the paved runway, but it's not decisive. Visual distinctiveness, this is a big one. For paved runways, they're very easy generally to find. It can be a slightly tough situation, but often they're fairly easy to find. These grass or dirt runways, and this one I'm going to color or kind of highlight red briefly, those are hard to find in many cases. Now, for the record, my first airport where I learned to fly was an airport with dirt runways, but it had 3 parallel runways, a crosswind runway. These runways were all in the order of 4,000 feet or longer, and it was actually quite distinctive even though it was a dirt runway. So there's any number of exceptions, but quite typically these grass or dirt runways can be very hard to find, and that creates a bit of a problem. Getting to the ground first without hitting things like power lines at low altitude, yeah, people are generally smart enough not to build power lines over runways, so that's fine. Hard surface is definitely preferred. Paved runways by definition are hard. Grass or dirt runways, that can vary somewhat. You can have a soft, muddy field in different times of the year, depending on what the weather has been. That's going to vary a little bit. It's not decisive. What I'm calling a long flare area, okay? Paved runways for these kinds of airplanes with these kinds of speeds, yes, there can be rare exceptions, so I put a small asterisk there. The grass or the dirt runways, it can vary, but it's not uncommon for, typical private owners, with a farm or something like that, to have a grass or dirt runway that's not only hard to find, but it's also quite short with maybe trees down on one end and it's clear to the other. Just the way they build these things. So there is no guarantee about that. These grass or dirt runways can be, it varies, problematic in that regard. If you get down to the ground, I'm assuming for discussion purposes that there's a long enough rollout area. Even if it's relatively short and you come in with a somewhat faster one of these airplanes, you'll at least get it down and slowed. And even if you kind of sort of loosely bump into something down at the far end, typically I think that's survivable. So this one maybe deserves an asterisk, but I'm going to consider it's long enough. These are wide enough by definition. You shouldn't be hitting people on the runway. Never, ever ask me about whether I know about somebody getting hit on a runway, because you're going to force me to tell a story I'd rather not tell, but that's for a different day. That does not involve me, by the way. All right. Not applicable as far as hitting things on the ground, and if you're not hitting anything, then you don't worry about whether it's hard or soft, whether it's symmetrical. Evacuation constraints, assuming you get out of the airplane, even if it's dinged up, you shouldn't have any other constraints like you're stuck up in a tree or out in the, gigantic lake out in the middle of nowhere, and you should be accessible to rescuers. People can get out to the runway. So the bottom line is that grass or dirt runways, they can be problematic, and because of the visual distinctiveness and the sometimes lack of length, that can be a big issue. It's not always true. Paved runways, obviously, and this is not rocket science here or brain surgery, paved runways are great. If you're going to make a forced landing and a paved runway is within gliding distance, clearly that's the best place to go. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about roads. I want to compare divided highways with two-way, two-lane roads. By extension, we will go up to four-lane roads as well. But typically, by the time you start adding lanes, what we're looking at is kind of an urban area, and those tend to be really bad. Even though the width goes up a little bit, the number of power lines, billboards, people that you might hit becomes really bad. So I'll kind of leave it at this, even if by extension we're also talking about wider roads. So divided highways, visible to witnesses. Yes, you are essentially guaranteed on any divided highway that somebody is either going to see you go down. I'm talking about you as if you're in the airplane, but they're either going to see you go down or somebody will find the airplane pretty darn quick and so on. Visual distinctiveness, yes, from an airplane. And again, assuming it's day VMC, okay, if we as controllers are telling somebody to look for something like a divided highway off their right or, maybe even back behind them a little bit, those things are very easy to spot. And so it's very easy to maneuver in that direction. Getting to the ground first. Rural is better. Obviously, a divided highway in an urban area is going to be more populated with people, okay, and you're more likely to have overpasses, billboards, the road signs that go over the road, power lines, things like that. You still really shouldn't have trees right there. So the more rural, typically, the better. As far as hard surface, yes, divided highways are going to be hard surface. Long flare area, I put yes with an exclamation, but also an asterisk. These divided highways, you very often get a stretch that's, perhaps miles long, except for the very occasional interruption with like a highway sign, or in some places you do get power lines that cross the road or something. And so these things are great. In fact, in some ways, they're even better than runways. Runways, because of budget constraints, we only build these darn things to be 4,000 or 5,000 feet long, and that's fine. But when you're trying to make a forced landing, it does happen from time to time that pilots have trouble with that distance, and they end up kind of off the runway lengthwise, as it were, for one reason or another. Divided highways, you in effect have so much length that they are, in that regard, better than many airports. Long rollout area, yes. Again, you have miles to stop typically, and so on. Width, I put yes with an asterisk. There can be some exceptions, but for divided highways, and I covered this in the previous video about the risk factors, typical GA airplanes, we're looking at wingspans on the order of about 36-ish feet, and that's plenty for 2 lanes plus that little median strip or shoulder strip you have on the median side, the wider shoulder strip you have over on the right. Again, there can be exceptions, so I put an asterisk. In terms of hitting other people, that's what jumps to mind as the primary risk factor with divided highways. But the reason I've put slow closure here is because for the airplanes with these kinds of speeds, the way that people drive on these highways most of the time is essentially pretty darn comparable to the kind of landing speeds that we're going to have in airplanes. Approach speeds will typically be a little bit higher than people are driving, but the touchdown speed is ballpark pretty darn similar. And so while it does on rare occasions happen that there is a collision with a car on a divided highway with some kind of closure rate, and of course that spinning propeller thing can be somewhat problematic, just factually speaking, the odds are pretty good, so it's not perfect, but that's not bad. If you do hit anything on the ground, you tend to hit hard things, potentially like maybe a speed limit sign or something along those lines. Okay. Again, this assumes you've gotten to the ground, and it can be a vehicle. Okay, and if you do hit things, you tend to hit them non-symmetrically. So again, that speed limit sign or that whatever sign over there on the right, typically you're going to catch it with the right wingtip, and that's going to swerve you. But typically, again, those tend to be fairly survivable because you're down, maybe somewhat slowed before you start doing that kind of stuff. Evacuation constraints, really no. And accessibility to rescuers, well, it's fantastic. Maybe I should change yes to yes with an exclamation point. But these divided highways and the rural is better. Those are fantastic sites. Okay, 2-way, 2-lane roads, and you can kind of tell where I'm going because I'm going to switch the ink color to red. Visible to witnesses, yeah, pretty good. Every once in a while you're on a road that doesn't get much traffic, and so it takes a bit longer, but that's still pretty good. Visually distinctive, oh yeah, you can see these things from the air. Getting to the ground first, danger, danger, danger. Just typically, again, it's always going to be a matter of luck in terms of what you actually get. But these typical like two-way roads, man, there is a huge statistical likelihood that you've got power lines running down one side of the road, occasionally crossing over to the farm field on the other side of the farmhouse on the other side of the road. You've got road signs right there. People have trees in their front yard that come practically up to the road, and you might hit a wing while you're on a tree while you're still flying. Danger, danger, danger. Those things are nasty. Now, if you make it successfully to the ground, almost always it's a hard surface. Occasionally you get a dirt road or something like that, in which case you're actually less likely to have these kinds of dangers. Long flare area, yes, I'll go. That'll vary somewhat. The long rollout area, again, that varies somewhat. Width, no, and I've kind of already alluded to this. These things are not wide enough typically. Whereas the divided highway with at least 2 lanes, you've got 2 lanes kind of plus some, and with the lane width being ballpark 12 feet, you do have enough width for a typical airplane like this. On a 2-lane road, you're only looking, and again, 12 feet is more of an interstate standard. Smaller roads with slower speeds are going to vary quite a bit. Certainly get in an urban area, it even shrinks a little bit. But you're looking at lanes that are just 10, 11, maybe 12 feet wide anyway. No meaningful shoulder in a lot of cases, and you've got stuff coming right up there. The width is really not very good. Also, especially on the 2-way, 2-lane roads, okay, you might think, well, I'll go to a rural area, I'll watch out for power lines, things like that. It seems like it's wide enough because I picked a spot where the trees are farther back. The problem is, the better the road in that sense to get away from these 2 dangers, the more likely that the head-on traffic is doing 50 or 60 miles an hour. You're touching down at 70. Airplanes do not have good ground maneuverability, and now instead of slow closure, we've got possible head-on traffic, and that is a problem. And then the remaining 4 categories are, a lot like what you have for the divided highway. Okay, let's go to the next thing about kind of what I'm loosely calling terrain. A lot of variability here, so it seems like I got carried away with typing up the word varies and so on. Farm fields, you may or may not have witnesses. All of these, you can see them very easily from the air. Farm fields, typically you can get to the ground first. There are exceptions and so on, especially if the field is a bit shorter. The surface surface itself varies quite a bit. They tend to be soft. Sometimes they're okay. Sometimes you actually get kind of lucky, if I can skip ahead, to hitting softer things on the ground. So sometimes you get kind of a vegetation type thing. Let me switch back to green real quick. So sometimes you get kind of, vegetation with crops that are sticking up, and that provides kind of the softer cushioning of things that you're running into. If so, you're going to tend to hit those pretty symmetrically and so on. And so even if the surface is a bit softer, in effect what I picture is like the corn stalks are going to kind of help hold you up so that you're not sinking down in and possibly flipping or coming to a sudden stop. The length of the flare area is pretty big. I put not applicable for all of these for the long rollout area because these tend to have fairly quick stops. Okay, you get into a farm field, you're not typically going to roll for a half mile like you might when you're just touching down on a paved runway, not getting on the brakes in some of these airplanes. Okay, as far as width, farm fields are fine typically. No hitting other people. Again, there's not usually big clumps of people out in the middle of farm fields and so on. Evacuation constraints, typically no, there can be some rare exceptions. And accessible to rescuers. That one's actually a little tricky. Sometimes if you end up in a farm field, that field can be quite muddy. Also, if you land in the middle of a big multi-acre cornfield or something like that, sometimes the airplane is not visible to people on the ground, and it might take a while for rescuers to get there. So again, that varies quite a bit. As far as open terrain, this is a catch-all, so you understand that a lot of this stuff varies. Visible to witnesses, typically pretty poor if you're going out in some open area. Getting to the ground first, that can vary. Again, it tends to be more things like trees and that kind of stuff rather than billboards and power lines in the middle of nowhere. Surface can vary quite a bit. The length can vary quite a bit. Width is usually something where you can find a decent spot. However, the problem is if you don't, then maybe you're looking at hitting trees and things which don't have much give unless you get a little bit lucky, and the hits tend to be non-symmetrical. So the width thing, I've put yes, but there can be exceptions on that. Evacuation constraints can vary, and accessible to rescuers, that can vary and typically is often quite poor. Forests or trees, it's not my idea of fun to go land an airplane in a forced landing in an area of trees. Sometimes there's little or no choice for a variety of reasons. Among the reasons that you might pick is because typically you're not looking at threatening other people on the ground. Now, whether you're visible to people in the first place can be problematic. It's easy to sight trees from the air. Practically by definition, you're not going to get to the ground first. We don't care about the surface because you're not even really going to get to the ground until the airplane's so slow it doesn't really matter. Long flare area, this might surprise you, yes. And what I mean is, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit on this, and to some extent this. In terms of the flare area, it almost becomes infinite. And what I mean is, we talked about the divided highways having, maybe miles. Well, if you're going to land in trees, I will talk about it later in the tips section, but the short version is it's actually best, and this is counterintuitive, if you want to land slow, it's actually best to approach a little bit fast. And the reason you do that is if you approach really slow, you don't have the energy to do the round out and kind of flare, and also, you might be so slow, if for many pilots, that they risk stalling. It's actually best to come in a little bit fast. Okay, that way you have the energy for the round out and so on. And that's actually why there's a difference between water near the shoreline and, well, I'm going to go to something else later. I'm not going to get into that. Sorry. But what happens is you typically will bring in a little bit of extra speed, and then you have the energy for the flare. Okay, and that's partly technique that we will give to pilots as a tip if they're going to land in water, and that will vary depending on whether they're going to land in open water or water near the shoreline. As far as the long flare area, and my mistake for not catching this as I was filming this live because I don't script every word, as you understand. The difference between open water, yes, you're not going to hit anything. You have really, truly infinite length as far as that flare area. For water near the shoreline, it can vary. So you can get to kind of a small retention pond, in an urban or suburban environment, and there's not too much flexibility on the room. It's not infinite length. As far as the long rollout area, it'll be a sudden stop. And any of these three, as I mentioned, it should be, it's really not even applicable because you are going to, you're not going to hit anything in the air as far as that goes. The no hitting other people with forests and trees is safe. Hitting softer things on the ground. I'm going to put varies here because a lot of this depends on what kind of luck you have with the trees. Sometimes you're hitting, big, thick trunks that don't have much give, and that's really bad. It breaks things like wings off right away. Other times you can get a little bit lucky with trees where you catch more of the leafy, tops and things, and the branches have a fair amount of give, and there can be some cushioning. With trees, you sometimes can get a bit lucky. Symmetrical hits, that's pretty rare in many cases. Evacuation constraints, that varies tremendously, including there are cases where somebody's stuck up in the tree, all right? And accessibility to rescuers, that can vary and in many cases be quite poor. Water near the shoreline or open water. Visibility to witnesses, it varies. You might be near fishermen or people on the beach or whatever who see you go down in open water unless you land near a ship or something like that. Typically, people don't see you go down. You can see water, from up above real quick. Getting to the ground without hitting anything in open water, yeah, there are no billboards or power lines built out over the open water. If you're near shoreline, you should be able to without any real problem. Surface, as far as hard or soft, we prefer hard. Water for forced landing purposes is really considered a soft surface, okay? And these tend to be kind of bad in one sense because the airplane can dig in, can flip, and so on. And in fact, for any of the soft surfaces, the generic rule of thumb is leave the landing gear up on a retractable gear airplane. So if you have a fixed gear airplane that's going to go down in water, there's a decent likelihood, if not even a probability, that the airplane will flip upside down, and that's going to complicate the evacuation. Among other things, if we're talking to a retractable gear airplane who's going to go down in water, it is almost universally best to leave the gear up in terms of tips and things we might think about. We already covered this a little bit, even if I kind of mucked it up a little bit. Don't hit any people. Sometimes if you're landing near the shoreline, you might be unlucky enough to hit somebody out swimming if you're trying to put it down in front of a beach because you want to be in front of witnesses. So do look out for that. Open water, you should be pretty safe. There are a few people swimming out in the middle of Lake Michigan. As far as hitting softer things on the ground, again, because it's a soft surface, you tend to get the sudden stop, and so in effect that is poor, and maybe even I should put not applicable here. Symmetrical hits, yes, with an asterisk for both. If you land with one wing low and kind of catch that wing, you can cartwheel, and that can be bad, but typically you should be able to hit pretty symmetrically and things. Evacuation constraints, yes, you may or may not be upside down. You might be in an airplane that's going to sink somewhat rapidly. Airplanes tend to float fairly well. I don't want to take that to the bank and so on, but definite evacuation constraints, even if you get out of the airplane now, you still need kind of rescue overall, and so I'm going to include that in rescue constraints. It's a bit better if you're near shoreline and there's witnesses who can rescue right away instead of being out in open water. So some difference, but not much. And then accessibility to rescuers, again, it varies depending on whether people see you and can get to you quickly versus open water. So, all right. Last category is sort of these kind of urban development areas. And again, none of these are good. We're looking for what is least bad. Golf courses. And again, remember, we're talking day VMC. Visible to witnesses, yeah, they build golf courses so that people go out there and use them. So typically, not always, you will be visible to witnesses. They're very easy to spot from the air. As far as getting to the ground first, again, a lot of these golf courses have trees. Usually not billboards and power lines for hopefully obvious reasons, but there's a lot of trees. There's a lot of variability and so on. Ironically, probably the nicer the course, the more trees it has and fairways that bend around. You go out to these, let's call them budget courses. No offense, but you go out to the budget courses out in more, suburban and / rural areas where it's just 18 wide open holes and a few trees, and it used to be a big farm or something before the golf course company bought it and put a golf course in there. It tends to be more open. The surfaces are actually fairly hard enough for aircraft landing purposes, so I've put hard. Okay, that can vary. The long flare area, it varies quite a bit. We can joke about par 3s being poor, par 4s maybe being okay on the fairways, par 5s being better. But again, a lot of that depends on the trees and so on. As far as the long rollout area, typically you're not going to have good braking, and if you compare the rollout lengths with even the par 5 fairways, typically you're not going to get it slowed and stopped without hitting something, unless you're in what I'm loosely calling these rural budget golf courses. So those tend to be pretty poor. Having said that, typically, if I can kind of skip ahead for a second, you will get it down and slowed, and you have some control over hitting softer things and hitting somewhat symmetrically. So tends to be survivable, but golf courses, you're typically going to ding up the plane unless it's a particularly slow aircraft. Width is usually fine. There can be exceptions. No hitting other people. Again, they put golf courses so that people go on them. You pilots would need to be aware of that. As far as hitting softer things on the ground, it kind of depends on what you're going to hit. Symmetrical hits, again, that can vary. Again, you come into a semi-narrow fairway, you might catch a wing on a tree that turns the airplane, then you go off into the trees, and that can be bad. Although, again, typically once you're on the ground and slowed, the survivability rates go up. Evacuation constraints, typically no. Accessible to rescuers, yes, even if they're using golf carts. What I'm loosely calling sports field complexes, where they build a bunch of baseball diamonds and or soccer fields, that kind of stuff. Visible to witnesses, it varies. And this one, it actually varies enough. Sorry, I wanted to actually do that in yellow. I'll just leave it in green. But this one, a big difference occurs on whether it's a Saturday morning or, say, a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday at 2 p.m., there's not a lot of kids out there in the sports field complexes. But on a Saturday at 11 a.m., during the summer months, there are hundreds of people out there. And so this one varies dramatically with the day of the week and to maybe some extent the time as well. But the weekends, maybe the evenings, these can be bad. We do not want to be hitting kids. But, 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, these tend to be fairly wide open. Okay, my apologies to the guy who's out mowing the grass. Visual distinctiveness, yes, they're easy to see typically. Getting to the ground first, usually you can get there. Sometimes there are constraints. The surface is kind of hard enough typically for what we need. I don't even really need the asterisk there. The long flare area, that varies quite a bit. You get 3 or 4 soccer fields kind of out there kind of strung together. You actually have a very good, sometimes you have just a baseball field or something like that. I won't tell the story here. My dad one time had to make a forced landing into a softball field at an elementary school. He had a very poor flare area. That's a story for a different day. He was fine, by the way, even if my dad's as nuts as I am. All right, the long rollout area, again, poor with, they tend to be just fine on that. No hitting other people. I've already covered this. It varies a lot between a Tuesday morning and a Saturday midday. Hitting softer things on the ground, that varies. Symmetrical hits varies. Evacuation constraints, typically no. Accessible to rescuers, yes. Large parking lots. This can be anything from like the Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart, to a strip mall of a decent size, to a shopping center, shopping mall type things. Visible to witnesses, typically yes. Okay, visual distinctiveness, yes. Getting to the ground first, actually quite poor. These things, a lot of times, these have things like light poles to help light up the parking lot at night and so on, and they tend to be very poor. They do a lot of like landscaping with these 20-foot high trees kind of on the islands and so on, and it's actually very hard to kind of pick something out in many of these places. So in urban areas, it might be better than a lot of other areas, but they're not great. Hard surface practically by definition. The long flare area, sometimes you can get lucky depending on the length of the parking lot. That varies quite a bit. Tends to be fairly poor. The reason I put long rollout area as poor is because a lot of times these things have curbs, and even if a pilot can get it down onto the ground, it's not uncommon that very quickly you're into curbing of one sort or another, ripping off the landing gear, stuff like that, and that can lead to some very sudden stops. Width, typically you're going to be fine. Can be exceptions. Hitting other people, that varies quite a bit. Nice thing is usually they're going to be in cars, and so they're somewhat protected, although the closure rates will be big. Even if they're at parking lot speeds, the airplanes are not. Hitting softer things on the ground, that can vary. Sometimes you get lucky and hit vegetation or a fence. Sometimes you're hitting harder things like cars, curbs, light poles, things like that. Symmetrical hits, that really varies quite a bit. And then evacuation constraints and accessibility to rescuers, no real constraints, and usually they're fairly accessible, obviously, because if you can drive cars in there, you can drive the fire trucks in there, right? Okay, so let's kind of combine this up in a minute. So step one, now let me just escape out of the highlighter because I don't need it anymore. So Okay, so building up the chart. We talked about steps 1 and 2 already, so understand the basic situation. I went through that as if we're concentrating on day VMC for normal single-engine aircraft, and then break it down into sections, kind of compare apples to apples to the extent you can. But then step 3 is controllers. You need to know your airspace that you work. There is wide variety. I will talk about that in a minute. And then adapt the chart as needed for your airspace. So the whole idea is not to memorize kind of what I went through, but to sort of engage and try to think through how this stuff is going to work. And in some cases, you can even adapt very particularly for your own local circumstances. So let me give some recommendations to my fellow controllers. I'm going to loosely break controllers up into 3 groups: tower controllers, TRACON controllers, and then route controllers. I know that sometimes, you have an up-down, so, tower TRACON can be combined. So tower controllers, the recommendation that I would make personally is that you in effect pre-scout your airspace from time to time in some detail out to ballpark 10 miles out from the airport. So take a look at maybe other airports in the vicinity, okay, including any grass strips, any highways, okay, and I'll show you in a little bit in this video what I mean by some actual detailed pre-scouting, but take a look at highways. Are there any kind of divided highways that are particularly good? Sometimes you might find some divided highways that are particularly bad, but they're still perhaps the best thing. Consider golf courses in the vicinity, sports complexes, things like that, and include especially within 3 miles from the airport boundary. And the reason I've put that about within 3 miles is because in a lot of cases for tower controllers, you might be in a situation where for one reason or another, just after takeoff, maybe inbound for landing, maybe because they had an engine failure at a somewhat higher altitude and they're trying to come in and they're switched to your frequency or something like that, and they're trying to reach the airport and ultimately they're going to be, a couple miles short or something like that. You need to have a very good feel, if you can, for the airspace or the terrain types within roughly 3 miles of the airport boundary. That's a little bit different from just 3 miles from the geographic center of the airport reference point. And again, that's not too big of an area. It doesn't take that long to kind of go through that and so on, and just think through those kinds of options. Also for tower controllers, because you will typically be talking to airplanes down low, there isn't much time, so you kind of have to sort of pre-scout this stuff out. Otherwise, you're really just going to be taking a stab in the dark. TRACON controllers. You're working a wider area. You can be working airplanes up to ballpark 10,000-ish above the local terrain, which might mean that you have several minutes between the time that an engine failure occurs and somebody's on the ground. What I would recommend loosely for TRACON controllers, and by the way, for all these can be individual controllers, but also local safety councils who maybe, kind of set up some discussion for controllers. But anyway, back to the TRACON controllers. So I recommend sort of pre-scouting any airports in your airspace and also go a short distance beyond, so about 20 miles or so outside of the boundaries of your airspace. Again, it's not uncommon. You might be talking to somebody who's coming in or whatever, and you're talking to them and they're still, 5 miles outside your airspace, and they might turn around and go 10 miles to go somewhere, and that might be something you want to think about. So pre-scout airports. Some of these grass and dirt runways are perfectly fine for, the day VMC conditions. Others are going to be really lousy. Have some sense of what those are. Also, and make sure you include highways. Again, you don't have to memorize every mile of every highway, but get a sense of what you have kind of in your airspace and a little bit beyond for particularly the divided highways. There's a gazillion 2-lane roads, and so you're never going to remember all of those. Don't even worry about them, and if you want to look at them, they're almost universally bad anyway. But take a look at the divided highways kind of in and just beyond your airspace. In route controllers, this is much more of a judgment call because there's so much variability. There are center controllers who don't own to the ground because there's approach controls, all the way up to 10, 15, 17,000 feet or something. So if you don't own down to the ground, you don't have to do as much, frankly. In effect, you're lucky in that sense. If you're something like Minneapolis or Salt Lake Center or some of the areas in Indy Center where I work and other places, you own down to the ground over wide swaths. And again, some of the controllers in Minneapolis and Salt Lake Center and Seattle and others, Oakland, you own huge multi-state size swaths of airspace down to the ground. There's no way you're going to remember this. So with some variability, use a judgment call depending on your airspace. Just become more loosely, generally aware of the concepts presented here and in the couple of related videos and so on, and just try to do the best you can Nobody expects that you're going to keep track of all the airports and divided highways and such in your airspace in those kinds of regions. Having said that, in those areas where some center controllers own to the ground over huge wide swaths, that is practically by definition more of a rural area, and so divided highways are typically pretty good. If you can just identify the highways, they're normally very good, unless you're like right in some local town or something like that, but much more of a judgment call and trickier for my en route controller colleagues. All right, we are almost done. One last look at the chart. Here's where we sort of put it all together, and we are almost to the point where I'm going to hone in on what I highly, highly recommend as the preferred best off-airport landing site. So clearly, for a forced landing situation, a paved runway is the best option. That's hands down what we would like to get to if we can. We can't always do that for one reason or another. Typically, it's the glide performance just isn't going to allow it. So if we're looking at the second best alternative for a forced landing where we are excluding, paved runways or even really any airport, because as I already hinted, I generally tend to be very skeptical about the grass and dirt runways. Divided highways are great when you kind of work across and compare it to all the other things. The more rural the divided highway, the better. In an urban area, the risk factor goes up, but rural divided highways are great. Other than those, normal other kinds of roads, man, I hate those things with a passion. They are dangerous. Pilots might go for them sometimes, if so I want to give them some tips about minimizing the risk and what to look for, but as a controller, I would not generally try to send people to roads. Farm fields is kind of the default catch-all of reasonably decent, and airplanes frankly do land in farm fields on a semi-regular basis, and the survivability odds are usually pretty good. There can be some bad luck with a variety of risk factors, but farm fields is kind of the generic catch-all, and you can kind of sense from the color coding that I'm either going to pick something like a rural divided highway or a farm field, but I'm leaving you in suspense for about 1 minute while we just talk on a couple other things. Forests and trees, I know we think they're lousy. The softer things that they might hit, there's surprisingly high survival rates. It's probably higher than you would guess for forests and trees. So if we're talking to somebody that they've got like nothing and they're going into an area with trees, give them some tips about how they can improve their odds as best they can. A lot of it's going to be kind of luck/providence, completely out of our hands, but don't give up on these folks. They actually have a decent chance. Water near shoreline, again, there's definitely no guarantee that that's fine, but that is kind of okay, especially in many urban areas where it's kind of slim pickings on the really good options. And then golf courses and sports complexes, with the sports complexes, very much keep in mind whether it's a Saturday morning or a Tuesday or something, but those are usually kind of the least bad in many urban or suburban areas, Large parking lots, I wouldn't really steer anybody towards myself, and if they're going to head for that, use caution, and there's not a whole lot of detail we can add, just fly it under control. So without further ado, where are we between rural divided highways and farm fields for my best preferred off-airport landing site? And it's going to seem like I'm cheating. I recommend for Day VMC normal single-engine aircraft a rural divided highway, and preferably, if you can, near a field that you can sidestep to. Now, it seems like I'm cheating, Well, here's my answer. A rural divided highway. If you can't make it to an airport for these kinds of airplanes, a rural divided highway is, to my mind, hands down. It still has risk. It's not perfect, It is hands down the least bad option. But instead of just picking any old stretch of a rural divided highway, if a pilot can, if they set up to land next to a field that they can sidestep to when they get down low, if they're just unlucky and there happen to be the rare power lines across the highway, or traffic is just backed up, or it's a construction zone and nobody had realized that till the airplane got down low, it's a very simple matter to sidestep to the farm field right next to the highway. You still get the witnesses who see you go down. You still get very good accessibility to the rescuers controllers who are going to come in and rescue a pilot and so on. And those kinds of fields are better than ones out in the middle of nowhere where it's less likely for witnesses to see you and it's harder for the rescuers to get to. So if we are, as controllers, are talking to somebody who has an engine failure, they're looking at making a forced landing, by all means try to get them to a runway. But if for some reason it's clear that no runway is in sight or reachable, either from the beginning or kind of during the emergency, I absolutely endorse the idea of controllers, if we have one available, vectoring an airplane roughly towards a rural divided highway, telling the pilot about that. Depending on the ability we've had to pre-scout it, depending on whether we're tower, TRACON, or en route, giving them some heads up about how safe that particular stretch of highway might be, telling them if they find a stretch of rural divided highway that they're going to head for, if they can, try to land next to a field that they can sidestep to, that they can safely, choose as a low altitude option B if they need to. So it still has some risks, but because of the so-called infinite length, actually in some cases, in many cases, these places are better than short runways. So with some reservation, because no site is perfect, the rural divided highway, preferably near a field that they can sidestep to, is, to my mind, hands down the best option. We got 2 more slides to go. We'll go through these fairly quick. Number 1, just adapting for other situations. So first of all, what if it's restricted visibility for night and or IMC? At night, the general rule of thumb is that paved runways are lit. Of course, you might have to turn on the pilot-controlled lighting by preferably sending another aircraft over to that CTAF frequency and having them key the mic, repeatedly to turn the lights on, rather than have the pilot with the problem have to go over there. So you might have to get the lights turned on. But paved runways, the general rule of thumb is that they're lit, and so they become visible, even though it may or may not be harder to see them than it is in the day. Sometimes it's easier. Unpaved runways are generally not lit, and so even if unpaved runways are at least viable in the day, at night, generally forget about it. IMC, you can't really see anything until you're quite low. Presumably, I don't need to explain that to you. Now, if as controllers we can get an airplane to the immediate airport environment, by that I'm loosely thinking within a couple miles or so, and then they can get below the clouds and they see the airport, and they're still ballpark 1,500 feet, at least 1,000 bare minimum, they actually have a chance to maneuver for landing on a runway or even a taxiway perhaps or something. Okay, but if the ceiling is lower than about 1,500, 1,200, it's like they're not going to break out, and so those situations where we're sending them to an airport and it's IMC, okay, or there's no airport available, that's going to require advanced consideration. Engine failure when it's IMC and the clouds are lower than 1,500, really, there's no getting around it. That's just going to suck, and that's going to require advanced consideration whether you like it or not. For faster, bigger aircraft, so again, the tipping point is kind of once we get up to those single-engine turboprops, any piston twin, certainly any jet type thing. Even though the rural divided highways are great for the small airplanes, the road width and closure speeds suddenly become problematic even for rural divided highways, and at that point, the best options for the bigger, faster aircraft tend to be either long farm fields or something like water. By the way, that's where Sully and Skiles put US Air 1549 on a long stretch of water. It was plenty wide enough. Okay, it did carry risks and so on, but that was much better even if they'd had a rural divided highway as opposed to just the highways that were available there in New York City. For those kinds of airplanes, typically leave the gear up and they go for a field or water, and that is what is least bad. And so for the last slide on this, we're actually going to go over to a couple things outside of the PowerPoint real quick. Just as I'm filming this, it turns out that yesterday afternoon, and this happens on a semi-regular basis, so I'm just going to use something that popped up in my inbox this morning. Yesterday, as I'm filming this, there was a forced landing of a B-36 turbocharged Bonanza, November 837 Mike Lima, about 3 miles north of Lubbock, and we're just going to spend about 5 minutes or so on a quick case study just to use this as a real-world demonstration of the kinds of things I'm talking about. So let's jump to this. I'm going to start with Google Maps. I'll just give you one quick example. So pick your airspace if you're going to do pre-scouting. I'm just going to randomly, go somewhere over in central Missouri or something, okay? And so let's pick What I'd like to find is maybe an example of a 2-lane or a 4-lane. Okay, so this Highway 65 is a divided highway. It's a rural divided highway. It doesn't have to be an interstate. If you want to do some pre-scouting, just pick something in your airspace, or just go anywhere in the country if you want to sort of play around with it. Put the little Street View guy somewhere and do this repeatedly and kind of see what you have. Okay, traffic is light enough. It's moving at kind of airplane landing speeds, absence of billboards and power lines, things like that. Again, there's always going to be a little bit of luck in the exact spot you go to, but that's not bad. It doesn't have to be an interstate, so I'm just eyeballing. It looks like this 65, okay? I would call this kind of a rural divided highway. Somebody might set up next to a field that they can sidestep to. And if I use the little Google Earth Street View guy, Google Map Street View guy, we'll see what we get. Again, there can be variability. Again, that's not bad at all. It looks like, I'm just eyeballing, it looks like there might be some power lines down here by the intersection. There is, and so on. But again, statistically, that's pretty good, and somebody might set up for one of these, and whether it's at an intersection or between intersections, if they see power lines or something else that happens to be a problem, it's fairly easy for them to sidestep, and obviously the Google car didn't drive in the field here, but sidestep over to this field. Even if you flip, you're going to have people driving by. They're going to figure out that the upside-down airplane is something they should stop and consider helping with, and so on. All right, so let me bop out of this. We will go back to this in a minute in a different place, and I'm going to use this example of this Bonanza that crashed yesterday in Lubbock. So just very briefly, this pops up in my news box because I'm weird enough. I subscribe to things like this in my customized news feed. So here's pilot manages crash landing without injury 3 miles north of the Lubbock airport. It's a little dark, so it's a little tough to tell, but you can kind of picture that there's a Bonanza sitting out in the field. Looks like the gear is up. Okay, pilot was able to crash. Yes, provocative word there. Avoid injury after reporting a partial power loss in his aircraft on Wednesday evening. I'm filming this on Thursday morning. Here's the approximate address where he went down. It says he called dispatch. I suspect he was talking to air traffic control. It's so early, I don't know for sure. I assume for discussion purposes, and I'd be surprised if I'm wrong here, that he was talking to Lubbock Tower and was still talking to Lubbock Tower when he had an engine failure, turned around, tried to come back, and for whatever reason ended up down here. Where he went down was in a field near Interstate 27, for what it's worth. Assuming that Tower was talking to the spot, I have no idea how that conversation went. So I'm going to use this more generically as kind of a representative example of these kinds of things. I'm not per se commenting on this particular accident yesterday where the pilot walked away just fine, but I want to kind of consider it. The local news did include something from FlightAware, and because of that, I know exactly where the airplane landed. Very quickly, let me go to FlightAware, and I've already sort of set this up to where I can track it itself. Now, I do have a separate video about tracking airplanes using FlightAware or maybe Flight Radar, or flightradar24.com. Live during emergencies, go to that video. At the moment, I personally have a preference for FlightAware. I've had a couple people I know say, Flight Radar 24 might be better. I'll keep an open mind. For the moment, I will briefly look at both of them and just touch on the pros and cons, although I've done a separate video that explores more of some of the details of this. So starting with flightaware.com, this is obviously the morning after, but it is possible it's delayed by about a minute if somebody at a supervisor's workstation or something can pull up FlightAware. To pull this up, you can actually track the plane only about a minute behind what's live and so on. And so very briefly, we're not going to go into detail. This guy took off from the airport that has a field elevation of ballpark 3,700 feet. I'm just going off of that. I don't know separately for sure that that's Lubbock's field elevation. Looks like he took off on runway 27, if that's the runway that's out there, and kind of a left turn departure heading up to the northwest to wherever he was going, and somewhere up in here looks like he's leveling off at 7,500-ish feet. Might be IFR at 8,000, and the mode C is effectively a little low for reasons I'm not going to get into. But somewhere in here it looks like he has the engine failure because suddenly he's turning back and the speed drops. So I could be wrong, but I think he has an engine failure here. I will assume for discussion purposes that he was talking to Tower and said something like declaring an emergency, partial engine failure, or engine failure coming back. And I'm going to assume for discussion purposes, I clearly don't know, that Lubbock was able to say something like clear to land on 1-8 or something like that. Again, I don't want to get into the weeds on exactly what happened with this pilot. I'm a little surprised that he turned kind of a base like this before turning in. He might have thought he was high enough he could do that. I'm kind of hoping that Tower didn't vector him on a 90 heading to set him up for the right base, because it's better to head pretty much straight. You'll notice coincidentally it's right next to Interstate 27. Seems like kind of a rural-ish interstate divided highway to me. For what it's worth, he ends up, and I'm not quite sure why it shows the very small turn at the end, okay, and because I didn't quite finish it, it's going to kind of animate him doing the final turn at the end. I'd be a little surprised if he really made a turn at the end, partly because he appears to be 100 feet underground-ish here, and during this last little bit, his speed is the same, so I think there's a small data anomaly. So never, ever, ever take Flight Aware or Flight Radar 24 if you're using it live as exactly perfect information. By the way, for people who look at it the morning after like I do, there are all kinds of little tiny data glitches. You need to use these things with caution. But to a first approximation, I assume for discussion purposes that he landed approximately here and so on. And based on the flight path, it was at least possible that he would be able to come in. Remember I said for tower controllers, try to pre-scout things within about 3 miles of the airport boundary. So using this as kind of a grid here, something in 1, 2, 3-ish, okay, I would like to have Lubbock Tower controllers, sorry if I'm assigning you work here, to have at least some sense of how good this is. Now this is rural, but there's a little bit of a built-up area. The problem is that on something like this, this is useful for tracking, but you can't really pre-scout. If I go to Google Maps and go to that same area, you can use the little Google Earth Street View guy and sort of pre-scout in advance and have a sense of whether this is reasonable or not. I confess I took a brief glance at it earlier this morning just to get some sense of it. But again, you know, it varies somewhat. These may or may not be tall enough that they would catch a low-wing Bonanza where a high-wing Cessna would be fine. It does have some light poles in the median that should be far enough back. If I go back this way a little bit, okay, there are some occasional, did I go a little too far? I think I went too far, but there are occasional power lines out over the highway. Where'd they go? You'll have to take my word. There are some occasional power lines over the highway, but there are fields that they can sidestep to. So you can sort of pre-scout these areas for center controllers without getting into too much detail. You can combine that. You might get a very good sense of where the airplane is from something like Flight Aware, Flight Radar, and if you are real quick on the computer, you can go to wherever the airplane is. Okay, I'm just going to pick some random spot, and if you know that they're out near 59 or something like that, or this, is it 59 and 30, okay, you might be able to know that somebody's over here they're looking at, and you might pick the largest road in the area because presumably it's the best and maybe most likely to have the Google Street View guy. Let's take a look. Wait for the internet to load. We don't care about that. Okay, this one, okay, you might be clear of power lines for the most part. There are lines that cross the road, and watch out for head-on traffic if you're going to consider the road. So you might think about, if you're heading for a road, try to pick a stretch where you're next to a field you can sidestep to if there's traffic or power lines in the vicinity, that kind of stuff. All right, enough on that. One other last thing I will note about Flight Aware. I have this map which has, it's called the satellite with boundaries. Here's the problem. I'm using my personal account. If you don't have an account, if you're not logged in, okay, so let me just log out real quick. The way Flight Aware is set up, at least now, you don't have access to that, so you don't get that level of detail. That map, okay, you need to log in to use that kind of stuff. All right, so, all right. Partly because of that, Flight Radar 24, it has pros and cons, okay? I'm not going to go through. You can do the similar kind of thing here with Flight Radar 24. I am, again, logged in. Notice, among other things, and if I kind of move this back, I can even sort of track a little bit about the ground speed, the vertical speed, and so on, along with this kind of stuff. If I log out for a minute, okay, you will notice that on the map, we still get the satellite, okay, so we can still get that even if you're not logged in. So at just a regular, Soup's computer, if you go to Flight Radar 24, that might be better. However, I don't know that it matters that much. You do lose a couple things like the vertical speed and so on like that. So pros and cons to those sites. But anyway, this is going to be a tall task. It's going to be a little different for tower, TRACON, and en route controllers, and there are a lot of factors to think about. But the bottom line is, what I'm recommending is that rural divided highways, preferably near a field that they can sidestep to, is hands down the best potential forced landing off airport site, even though it still carries risk. Thank you very much.